Okay, good morning again, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this webinar on the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council held through Working Group 4B of the 10YFP Sustainable Public Procurement Program. My name is Cahulan Kelly. I am a consultant at the UNEP DTIE office in Paris, and it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, who is Christina Mackin. She is the Director of Programs at the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, and she'll be taking it away in just one moment. Before we get going, though, I'd like to just briefly give you an introduction to the GoToWebinar tool if you have never used it before. All attendees are in listen-only mode at the start of the webinar, and so if throughout the course of the presentation you have a question or a comment, please feel free to raise your hand, and there should be a button on the GoToWebinar control panel that will enable you to raise your hand, and we'll get to your question in due time. Otherwise, there is a question box in which you can type your question, and we'll be able to read it and answer it out loud. The presentation will last 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end led by Christina. And again, this webinar is a part of the Working Group 4B on supporting SPP implementation through the use of Ecolabels and Sustainability Standards. And this is part of the larger work plan of the 10YFP Program on Sustainable Public Procurement, formerly known as the Sustainable Public Procurement Initiative. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to Christina Mackin, who is the Director of Programs at the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. So thank you for your attention, and take it away, Christina.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Mackin. As was mentioned, I am the Director of Programs for the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. What I wanted to do today was to give you an overview of the Council, our various work products, particularly our major deliverable for the end of 2014, a little bit about our governance structure and how our work is developed, and the process that we use to develop our content, and then talk a little bit about where different standards and eco-labels fit into the guidance that we're producing and how we're looking at those, and then finish up before Q&A with just a little bit of chatting about how you all, if you're interested, can engage in the work that we're doing. So just to start, for those of you who are not too familiar with the SPLC, our overall mission is to support and to recognize purchasing leadership. When we say purchasing, we mean institutional purchasing, that being state, federal, local, regional, agency-wide healthcare, higher education, or corporate purchasing that accelerates the transition to a prosperous and sustainable future. So uses its dollar that it's spending as a demand signal for making and affecting positive environmental, social, and economic change. We use the structure of a collaborative space, what we call a community of practice, where we convene leaders and convene members of this industry and of this part of the market to really begin conversations and help each other define, pursue, and promote sustainability leadership. So this includes not only institutional purchasers, but also suppliers who are regularly providing the products and services to institutional purchasers that will need to perhaps make changes to their products and services to meet the growing demand for more sustainably, for products and services with better sustainable attributes associated with them, and also the NGO community. So those advocates who have deep and significant expertise in particular areas where it's critical that they're part of the conversation to help us really understand what the key impacts are in particular purchasing areas, in taking particular actions through our purchasing, so that our institutional purchasers know that what they're doing is the most significant, most beneficial action that they can take. So the structure that we've chosen to use is quite deliberate, so that we can really facilitate that that type of interaction among those voices that don't typically have those types of conversations in absence of an organization such as ours. So just a little bit of history on us. We are an offshoot of the Keystone Center's Green Products Roundtable. This initiative started a little bit over 5 years ago, and was actually had a slightly different focus than institutional purchasing. They were initially looking at how to use and what to do with green products and eco-labels. How do you define a green product? How do you know, and what do we do with all of the hundreds of labels that are out there, and how do we prioritize them, etc. And what this group came to as they were kind of grappling with that question is that one of the key pieces missing in the conversation was simply how do we make sure that institutional purchasers simply know what to do with all of the different content and potential options that are out there, and that they're going through the processes necessary to set them up to be making the best decisions for their institution depending on what their specific purchasing profile is. And so the Green Products Roundtable made somewhat of a shift in its focus from wanting to look specifically at products and how do we define a green product, to how do we provide for purchasers the best resources we can to help them get on a path of making progress toward their environmental, social, and economic goals. So beginning in 2013, we began creating a founder circle of members to make a multi-year commitment to the council, and this was set up. I believe this was fully stood up in July of 2013. So all of these folks, these different companies, have made multi-year commitments to the organization in terms of financial commitment, as well as in terms of human resources commitment. So many of these companies have folks who serve on our committees. There's some side projects that we're helping to work on with them, and they're providing significant expertise to the work that we're doing. I'll just mention, in October of last year, we opened up our general membership, and since then we've climbed to just over, I believe, 120 SPLC members, which represents at this time a little over $200 billion of US spend per year. That is a small fraction of the just over 10 trillion potential dollars when we talk exclusively about US GDP that the SPLC sees as part of its target, and its potential influence that represents the institutional purchasing of products and services made in the US alone per year. This represents just about 100 million US jobs, which is directly or indirectly touches 70% of employment in the US alone, plus or minus 4 billion megatons of CO2 equivalent. So here, this is making an absolutely staggering amount of impact to the global GHG contribution. And so we see this as an opportunity for strategic leadership, certainly on the US scale, absolutely. When you expand that out on the global scale, there's an even larger opportunity, and we are setting ourselves out as an institution that is not only focused on the US, but is focused outside the US. We do engage and have members, including founding members and strategic partners outside the US, so that our tools speak broadly to a wide array of stakeholders. But many of the statistics we have that show the potential for affecting change are US specific. So one of the reasons that we choose to focus on purchasing entities or those institutions, and particularly at the institutional level, as opposed to simply, say, an individual consumer level, is that these organizations are very uniquely positioned to demand transparency with their dollars into both the upstream as well as the downstream impacts of goods and services. And so they can leverage that $10.2 trillion of spend per year, ideally in a coordinated fashion, across all of those institutions, to ask for more information on environmental, social, and economic impacts, demand improvements across those indicators, and demand that there are clear and transparent, that there is clear and transparent reporting on the part of suppliers of products and services in the market. Kind of flowing into that in the second bullet is that they're positioned to incorporate rigorous sustainability criteria into their decisions, and they have the capacity to do that at scale. And when you take one organization and you look at it as, one entire sector, and then one, maybe region of the world, and then, an entire purchasing community, you think about the impact based on the scale of that, and you see how quickly, how accelerated the change and the ripple effect in the market would be. This, of course, helps to drive down the cost of sustainable products. So this is where we see individual consumers coming into play. So we don't anticipate that our guidance and our work will ever necessarily be directed toward individual consumers, but we do see that our work will indirectly benefit them. So once institutional purchasers begin to make an impact in the supply chain and in the quality meaning sustainable attributes of products and services, it will allow not only other purchasing institutions to be able to afford them, but also individual consumers. So if you think about janitorial products, it's not just your everyday institution that now has access to green janitorial products. If you go to the supermarket, on the shelf are much more sustainable janitorial or cleaning products for your kitchen and your bathroom, that have far better, or at least the worst of the worst chemicals that were previously in those products as near as 10 years ago are no longer in them. So the work of the industry, the work of the procurement community can have that ripple effect into the broader individual consumer market. Institutions are also able to demand and ensure that the end users have the ability to understand, in terms of understanding and knowing how to use, like and prefer and adopt the new products and services, which means they can ultimately be part of that interim conversation of, products that may meet the use specification, and meaning that they perform as they're intended, but for whatever reason don't meet some other criteria in terms of what, from a consumer perspective, we would want out of that product. So lots of opportunity here. So I'm going to jump in at this point to talking about our guidance for leadership in sustainable purchasing, version 1.0. This is something that we will be putting out in January for a pilot, and I will talk to you about what a pilot means in a little bit. But as you see looking at this, there's kind of a three-part component to this, the first being a getting started section, the second being running the process, and the third, which is something we'll be pursuing in a later version of the guidance, getting recognition. So we see our guidance document as being two-part in terms of being process-based in actually helping institutions move through the process of enlisting support, scoping out what they need to do, their goals, delegating responsibilities, structuring internal and external engagement, understanding how their process will run, actually running the process of analyzing and understanding the impacts of their spend, creating an action plan based on that to target their highest impact areas from an environmental, social, and economic impact perspective. Actually committing to and implementing those actions on a specific timeline that they've set. Putting the right training in order and resources in place for those things to happen. And then the measuring and continuous improvement that becomes part of it. So there's that very specific process guidance of how do we go through and do this. And then there's also a set of what we would call more specific performance-based guidance that I think is where this group is a little bit more interested, that gets into specific purchasing categories. So say an institution finds through a spend analysis that the vast majority of their spending is going into IT hardware and electricity purchasing. So what are their options to lessen the most significant impacts associated with that purchasing? And one of the options for reducing those impacts could be the use of a standard or an eco-label in one of those purchasing areas. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I wanted you to understand that there's a two-part component to this. There's two layers. There's the process part of the guidance and the purchasing part of the guidance. Just wanted to touch briefly on our program committee structure before I jump into more detail. We are governed by a board of directors that works very closely with the Purchasing Council staff. They oversee the technical advisory committee that is really the decision-making body for all of our program committees. They have just stood up, just created 8 purchasing category technical advisory groups who are responsible for assembling the best available guidance in 8 different purchasing categories that I'll talk about next. To get into a little bit more detail about the guidance document that I was referring to, so one of the key places, as I mentioned, that I want to draw your attention to is actually what will be Chapter 4 of the Purchasing Category Guidance, Chapter 4 of the guidance document, which is the Purchasing Category Guidance. This is where our 8 purchasing categories will fit in, where content on standards and eco-labels will be part of the conversation. And I'm going to give you a little bit more information on the various categories we're looking at in a minute. But do note that this is one of the major parts of the guide that we have. I'm going to skip this one. So just to run through these quickly, one of the first sets of content that we're looking at is a group called chemically intensive products. The scope of this group breaks into 3 main areas, so it will be 3 chapters under that purchasing category, under that 3 sections under that 4th chapter for purchasing categories, being cleaning and sanitizing products, building maintenance products, as well as landscaping maintenance products. And we're going to, for the first round, be focused on the use phase. So for all of these different purchasing categories, we're trying to focus on as many different purchasing categories as we can. As many different life cycle phases as we can, knowing that many of the purchasing categories that we're looking at are extraordinarily complex and have deep technical as well as sometimes political issues. And so this is one of them that has both types of issues. And so we'd like to make some real progress on the use phase, and then move on to other life cycle phases at a later time. So something I want everyone to keep in mind as I'm moving through these different sections is that the charge of our technical advisory groups is not to create guidance, and it's not to create standards. It's to pull together the best available solutions. So the existing success strategies and best practices, that includes tools, resources, frameworks. Those may be labels, they may be some type of guidance resource that helps identify or provide a supplier scorecard assessment, something like that. Case studies that help a purchaser understand in a specific operating context how you can be successful in implementing a particular strategy or best practice. SPLC as an organization is not getting into the business of creating standards or frameworks for any one of these product categories. And so as I'm going through this, keep that in mind. We're doing a compilation and an assessment of those that exist to help us understand from an impact perspective which ones address the widest variety of impacts in those purchasing categories, and how does that relate to the most significant impacts of those purchasing categories. So to move on to the next one, construction and renovation is our second purchasing category. At least in the US, it tends to be a major spending area for particularly higher education, hospitals, oftentimes federal, state, local government. So this is a very common purchasing category we want to look at. So here the scope includes building materials and furnishings, site management services, so things like ice and snow removal, not quite landscaping services. We deal with that under chemicals, but other types of site services, and then energy and water use. Here we would like to look at the full life cycle phase. So with these materials and services, the impacts from extraction through disposal. The next category, which across the board will probably wind up being the most commonly purchased, the highest purchased area across nearly all institutions who use our guidance, at least up front, is electricity. So our scope here is looking at scope 1 and scope 2 electricity, and we're looking at a modified part of the life cycle phase, generation, distribution, and use. The next purchasing category is food, the scope being agricultural production, food service operation, as well as food waste. Again, here, as you can kind of tell by the scope, we're looking across the entire life cycle phase. So everything from extraction to impacts across manufacturing, distribution, use, and disposal. For IT hardware and services, the scope here is personal computers. So think of it as the computers or the components of that an office or an employer may purchase for their staff and give it to them. That's what we're looking for and thinking about when we say personal computer. On-site and cloud services, as well as electronic waste. So here again, we're looking at the entirety of the life cycle. We're also looking at a small subset of professional services, mainly that are couched under professional consulting, so things like financial, public relations, management, or legal consulting, with the life cycle phase being the use phase that we're primarily focused on. So it'll be focused for the most part on the impacts of consultant travel, the impacts of the energy use associated with the computers and the cloud computing and the electronic waste and the operations of the buildings in which the consulting services operate. It will be those types of impacts that in this first pass will be focused on. The seventh category is transportation and fuels. This includes employee travel, institutional vehicle fleets, including freight, generator fuels and steam plants. And this includes life cycle phases of extraction, manufacturing, distribution, and use. And then finally, we're looking at wood and agri-fiber products, which includes for 2014, just paper and composite wood. And then in 2015, we will look at apparel. And then this is across the entire life cycle that we're exploring impacts. I wanted to put on the screen just some example environmental, social, and economic factors to make a couple of points. First, that we know that ways of measuring all of the impacts that you see on the screen don't exist, despite the fact that we would like our committee members and those working on our guidance to be thinking this big in terms of, sorry. Oh. Sorry about that. We want folks to be thinking really big in terms of the potential impacts of a particular purchasing category. And even if something at this time can't be measured, but can perhaps be identified somewhere along the supply chain, we want to be able to, at minimum, identify that, with the purpose of being able to send the signal to a different part of the market, perhaps the NGO part of the market or a research think tank part of the market, perhaps the certification or eco-label part of the market that says there are a number of impacts associated with this particular purchasing category, with electricity, with IT, with construction that your labels don't address. They don't measure it. They don't certify to it. The label doesn't speak to it, but we know it's important. We can identify it in the supply chain. And so future iterations of your label need to address it if you want your label to be impactful. So that's part of, that's kind of an indirect benefit almost of the work that we're doing, is not just to tell purchasers, okay, here's a suite of options for you for what you can do now, but also turn around to the other half of the market and say, here's what we know, where, of the best available information that we can hand over to purchasers. Here are the gaps in it, and there are a lot of gaps, and these are the places where you all can come in and help fill those gaps. That's someone else's role in the marketplace. So one of the last things, as we continue talking about labels, eco-labels, that I wanted to draw your attention to. So as we write the chapters for each of the 8 purchasing categories, when we have the sections on solutions, so the menu of options that an institutional purchaser can use to improve the environmental, social, or economic impact of their spending in that particular area, they have a variety of different options, just simply in terms of categorization of solution types. And they might use one or another depending on some unique need of their institution. That's something for them to decide. That's a very internal decision for a particular institution. But those that you see in blue on your screen, I think tend to be the solution types that have eco-labels associated with them. So we see eco-labels that look at the efficiency of products. There's labels that you can get for offsetting some type of impact that you're having. You can get labels, obviously, for product performance that would lead to the action of product substitution. The same with supplier substitution. There are labels that exist that would lead you to change, to decide that you would want to choose one supplier over another. And then there are also other tools, not necessarily eco-labels, but certainly tools in the market, such as surveys and engagement and accountability surveys that help individual purchasers question and get specific answers on supplier behavior, where they are focused from a sustainability perspective, what actions they are taking. So all of this is to say is that there is a pretty significant area of overlap where eco-labels and the type of content that you all are looking at overlap with the type of answers that we're looking for, or where we would expect that what you're looking at could fit under our solution types in particular categories. And so from my perspective, it would be great to continue this conversation, absolutely from a program development perspective. So all of what I've been talking to you about has been programs and what we're working on for the remainder of the year, how that will shape the forthcoming pilot we're having in 2015. And one of the things we have our technical advisory group members focused on is, where they see a potential label that could fit into a purchasing category. So say, for example, in the US, for IT hardware, so a computer, the EPEAT program is often referenced for the performance of that computer from an environmental perspective, the attributes of it. That is one such label that could go on a product. And so the job of those committee members is to say, okay, well, what impacts does EPEAT look at? That's all we want to know. We don't want to value it. We just want to understand what impacts it looks at. And then we can communicate that, what impacts it looks at relative to what impacts exist in IT, in a piece of IT hardware in general. So I think there's a lot of potential, given the scope of work that you all have, for us to find ways to continue our conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we have a structure of that's set up as a community of practice. And so we consider ourselves a big tent organization that relies on the stories and the experiences of others to be able to help shape and inform the actions of our other members and the other folks within the community. And so that's something that we've already seen begin to develop, and it really helps to accelerate the pace of positive change. And so that would be something as well that is absolutely a great potential opportunity for engagement, sharing of your leadership initiatives, either specifically as individual members of the working group or collectively as you all meet specific milestones of your own work plans would be fantastic. If it makes sense for particular work that any of you are doing to be featured as a case study, either in our community of practice or within our guidance document, I would absolutely love to do that. So we could talk more about that. And then if it makes sense, depending on what organization you're from, if they may be interested in piloting and using some of the guidance that we put out in early 2015, and taking a section of it for somewhat of a test drive to see what works, what doesn't, where do we really need to supplement pieces of it. We would love to have you on board. So that's the end of my message. So it looks like we have, I think, about 20 minutes for questions, unless my clock is wrong. Is there anything else that you have on your end, Julian?
Thank you for that, Christina. To answer your question, no, we here at UNEP and as one of the co-leads of the 10YFP SPP program don't have anything to add to the presentation, but I feel like you just presented a lot of substance to us, and I'd be surprised if there weren't some comments or questions from our audience members. So I haven't seen a hand raised or any questions input into the question box on the GoToWebinar tool, but I'd like to open the floor to some questions for the next 15 to 20 minutes. Yeah, I have actually 17 minutes on my watch, but
okay.
But we can talk for as long or as short as is necessary. We've just gotten a question input from Angela Rangel from BSD Consulting, I believe. And her question is, what is your outreach in Europe? Christina, care to answer that?
Sure. We have a couple of strategic partners who are based in Europe. So we have a couple of different ways that folks can engage with us. We have general members, so organizations can pay for membership depending on the type of organization, and if we have like-minded missions, we can create strategic partnerships. So we have a number of those, and then really we are just at the beginning of some of our engagement and outreach in Europe and outside the US. So we have had some engagement, for example, in South America. We have started some in Europe. We are a team of 3, so our outreach is sort of slow, but we're absolutely focused on outreach, particularly in Europe, because so much of the work that you all do related to procurement includes things that folks in the US can learn from the great work that's already been done. So it's absolutely a priority for us, and we do have some strategic relationships set up already that we're continuing to grow.
Thank you for that. For some reason, I have it in my mind, Christina, that your colleague Sam Hummel at the SPLC is going to be present at EcoProcura in Ghent, Belgium, later in late September. Is that correct?
Yes, you will. Sam, who is our Director of Outreach and Operations, he will be at EcoProcura. Yes.
Okay.
And he has a presentation in their market lounge, or there's some space it's separate from like a typical education session. But yeah, he does have a specific speaking opportunity.
Additionally, and sort of as a side note, the 10YFP SPP program itself will be presenting both on a panel at EcoProcura as well as at the Market Lounge. So I know that we will be certainly connecting with Sam, and any of our participants right now who might be at EcoProcura could join us there and continue this discussion in person. We've got a question coming in from Fareed Yaker, who is a colleague of mine here at the United Nations Environment Programme here in Paris. And his question is, Christina, did you develop a specific methodology to measure impacts, or will you rely on the work of other organizations?
Right now, we are relying on the work of other organizations. So we are looking at a couple of different, depending on the impact type, there can be a couple of different methodologies. So, for example, in the social impact realm, there's a whole lot of different methodologies that are out there, and so we're looking at, as we see the impacts, the identified impacts come up, we're looking at the methods that were used to identify them. We're viewing it as the role of our technical advisory groups to provide that assessment and give their feedback on whether it's a sound methodology or not. But we are not developing our own methodology for measuring impacts.
Sort of as a side note, again, not to put too much of a plug here for the 10YP SPP program, but we have 2 separate working groups. other than this 4B working group on sustainability standards and ecolabels, one is working group 2A on monitoring and evaluation systems for sustainable public procurement. That is currently underway, being led by Eco Institute. It has released, it has produced a like a mind map of different monitoring and evaluation systems currently being employed around the world, and we're working on 7 different specific case studies, zeroing in on certain countries' monitoring and evaluation systems. Additionally, another working group within the 10YFP SPP program is starting up to be on actually just this this topic, measuring impacts and assessing benefits of SPP, and that's led by our mutual acquaintance, Dr. Anastasia O'Rourke.
Right.
So that's just a side note. Another question that has come in from Nadia Balgoban is, would SPLC or a member be ready to share concrete approach for the private sector in a workshop abroad? If yes, can they cover their costs or not? And
It depends on the specifics of the topic. So at this point, SPLC is pretty deep in our content development, but we do have some specific members who would have case studies that they would be able to share, or the council could share specific case studies on their behalf. In terms of cost, I can't necessarily speak to that, not knowing the details.
thank you for that. An additional question that has come in is, what is the origin of your financial resources? Is it public? Do they come from private sources? And is there a ratio that you're at liberty to divulge? And sort of a subsequent question is, do you plan to have enough resources to be able to carry through with this work that you've laid out in front of yourselves?
Sure. So that information is public, and we filed our first Form 990, which in the US is the mandatory form for 501c3 nonprofits, for 2013, so that all of our financial information is available on our website. At this time, the vast majority of our revenue comes from the membership structure that we have. So on an annual basis, each of our members pays dues to participate in the organization and to be recognized as a member. And so that revenue, the revenue model that we use shifts depending on the type of entity that we're looking at. So in an NGO, for example, that tends to have a relatively low revenue, and has potentially a relatively small amount of return on investment that they may get from their work with the council, has a smaller annual dues versus a manufacturer who has a very, very high annual revenue, and potentially because of the work that they would be doing and the understanding of the impacts that we would be looking at and how to incorporate them into their product development stream, has a whole lot of information that they can gain. They have a much higher due set. So you'd see on our website that there's a sliding scale membership fee based on the type of organization that you are and your role in the marketplace. We also do have a growing proportion of our funding coming from grants and foundations. So that is something that we do want to continue to grow, but it is, compared to membership, it's a sliver. Another revenue generating opportunity that we do host an annual meeting that is open to both members and non-members. We had our first one in the month of May, and that did generate quite a bit of revenue for the organization, which was great. And that is something that we intend to do early next year as well. And so moving through this process, continuing with our the membership model that we have, as well as on the membership growth trajectory that we have, we do expect the monies to be available into the next couple of years of operation.
Thank you for that answer, Christina. We have currently reached the end of the written questions input into the question box. And I don't see any more hands being raised currently, even though we have 5 minutes before this webinar was originally scheduled to be completed. However, I suppose that if participants would like to learn a little bit more about the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, we will be sending out a follow-up email with the website of the Purchasing Council, as well as Christina's contact information, if you agree to let us do that, Christina, to this
Absolutely.
working group 4B. And we'll follow up from there. This webinar has been recorded, and we will make that recording available on the SCP Clearinghouse working group for this working group 4B. Also, if there are any listeners not registered for the SCP Clearinghouse, I encourage them to do so by going to scpclearinghouse.org and creating an account for yourself there and requesting to being added to the working group 4B on sustainability standards and ecolabels. I just saw a hand from my colleague here, Fareed Yaker, and I'm going to unmute him. Fareed, did you have something that you would like to say?
Yeah, I wanted first of all to thank Christina for this excellent presentation. We now have a better idea of what SPLC does and what SPLC has plans to do in the future, and really we can better see the opportunities of collaboration emerging now and are clear to us. I wanted to ask Christina about the economic model that you plan to pursue in the future. Your guidance document and guidance products will be copyright free, will be public, or will you charge for them? That's my question. Thank you.
Our intention is to make them public.
All right, that's great. That's clear. So you plan to finance them through the revenues that you mentioned previously, right?
Right, and yeah, and depending on how our revenue model may need to shift over time, there may be portions of certain guides that would be for members only, but any foundational content we would expect to be public.
Great. That's in line with our own policy also. So we're happy to hear that. Great. Thanks a lot. And thanks for this great webinar.
Absolutely.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll follow up with you soon. Take care.